is lit. Confidential. Well, thanks for joining me, May Pang. I'm so excited to talk to you.
I'm here. I'm all here.
Yes, you are. So big congratulations on your documentary, The Lost Weekend, A Love Story. It came out in theaters in April, and it starts streaming, or it will be available to stream on Amazon Prime October the 13th.
Yeah, it'll be on all the different platforms, on Apple, on Infinity, or Comcast, whatever, they can actually pre-order it now.
Great.
They want to.
Well, I had the great good fortune to screen it over the weekend, and I loved it. It is fabulous. And the first thing that struck me was your narrative voice. I mean, it did. You are so engaging and warm and funny and smart and totally sincere. So it comes across as what the subtitle says, a love story.
Believe me, I was very nervous about this. It's taken so many years because I wouldn't do anything when people would say, "Oh, how about doing this?" And I said no. And a lot of people wanted my story put it into their story on John. And I said, no, I'm not giving you permission. And that's the end. And it just happened one day that Eve Branstein, one of the co-director producers, I said to her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I'm doing this, that." And then she goes, "Documentary." And I just swung my head around and go, "That's what I want to do."
Yeah.
And she just looked at me. She goes, "Are you sure?" So she had asked me many years earlier about my book. She wanted option and I wouldn't allow it. So we remained friends anyway. So for over 22 decades,
Wow.
So we never talked about it again. I said I didn't want to do it, and that was that. And it just happened to come up when she said, "I'm doing documentary." It had nothing to do with me, but that's what I wanted.
So you're referring to your 1983 book, Loving John, but you also did another book.
Well, it was called The Lost Weekend, John Lennon Lost Weekend, because I was adding something and a lot of people didn't know the time period that we're talking about, because people kept saying, "When were you with John?" Here, there. And I said, no, it's at this point. And then when I say The Lost Weekend, they go, "Oh, I know that one." So
do you remember the first time you heard that term, The Lost Weekend?
Yeah, John said it to me.
John, I was going to ask you who coined the term, but John did?
Well, John came up with it because he was a big lover of movies,
Ray Milland,
yeah, the Ray Milland. And there was no, he would say, oh, people would ask him, "What about that time you were drunk here and there?" And then he said, "I got so tired of people asking me. It was easy to say The Lost Weekend. It was just The Lost Weekend." He goes, because they would say, "How did you feel? How did you?" And he just kept getting tired. He says, "I know they'll be thinking that it's about you and me, but it's not." But he told.
This film is going to challenge a lot of people's perspectives on the mythological love story of John and Yoko. And in that respect, May, I think it's an incredibly powerful artifact, this film. And the irony is not lost on me. This is coming from a woman who, at the time of your relationship with John, didn't have a lot of power. So now you're exerting this incredible power over your story in this documentary. It's amazing how people's views of your relationship, that period, is really going to change. Starting with Yoko.
Yeah.
people viewed her during her time with John as kind of the dragon lady who broke up the Beatles. And then after he died, she's the grieving widow who had this incredible love story. That is not exactly the case.
No, it isn't. I waited for a long time. I mean, I know people kept saying, well, we hear you went out with John. We hear that, it's all, everybody thought it was a myth that I lived with this man.
Yeah.
And that's why I guess for a long time, I just didn't want to do anything. And the group, Eve, Stuart, and Richard, they did a fabulous job. I gave them their choice of do whatever. They knew what I wanted, but I had to trust them and I trusted Eve because I knew her the best.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, I didn't want to be one of those people that's sitting over them. So they were able to tell the story without me hanging over them. And they would obviously only come to me when I didn't even see the movie till when it was time for my narration. Unless it was something I would say, no, that picture didn't work. That's not my mother or my sister, so it was all just a minor thing, one or two things. But other than that, they did a fabulous job.
Oh, yeah. There have been so many books written about him, some very positive, some not so positive. But I think most people's perception of your story and the marriage of John and Yoko is really based on two movies from the 80s, and both of which Yoko had a hand in. One was the 1985 made-for-TV movie, John and Yoko, A Love Story, which is why I love that the subtitle of your film is a love story. And then there's the 1988 theatrical release film, Imagine, John Lennon, and you participated in that. What was that like?
That's the Andrew Solt one, I believe.
Yeah.
Is that the right?
Yeah.
And he came to me. He was legit. It's not somebody. You always want to know who's making the movie. And I was a little tired because every time I got in there, or if they filmed me, everything was just always edited. So I stopped participating except for a couple of things here and there. And then when they said, because I said, I don't mind you're talking to Yoko, Cynthia, and myself. Cynthia and I were very close. I said, but I didn't want to be a participant if I'm going to be edited in a way to fit somebody else. So that was one of the main reasons. But Andrew Solt did a fairly good job. I mean, I'm minimized. A lot of them would always say, we know we have to have you in here. Because, there's a chunk that yes. She's not a part of. And who was there? It was me. And it's almost said like, we have to have you because they didn't know the full story. So I was, they didn't want to acknowledge everything because that opens up another can of worms, especially if Yoko has a hand in it. So they're trying to make it all work.
Oh, yes. And you definitely get the feeling that she's orchestrating everything in terms of making the myths and what story gets out there. So let's start shattering some of them. First of all is the myth that John and Yoko had this idyllic relationship. What did you see before you got together with John? What were you observing in terms of how they were interacting?
They were more to me like, not so much husband and wife, but just a business partner to each other. They worked together. I mean, you could see that they cared for each other, whatever it may be. They took care of each other, but it wasn't the lovey-dovey what you think of that. It's really more because in the morning there was a routine. John would wake up a little later. Yoko was up early. She gave the orders most of the time, and John would do whatever he does best, which is writing or watching television, whichever fancied. But she'd be the one to have all the business stuff going on.
You get the sense that she kind of looked at him as a bit of a child that she could control, manipulate. Was that your sense as well?
Yes, as time went on, I saw that more and more. It's like, oh, John, you can't do this. Oh, John, she used to be upset at the fact that nobody took her seriously. And they all looked to John. So she would get very annoyed by that.
Did you get a sense of what he really thought of her as an artist? Was he as supportive as he seemed to be of her art?
I think he was as supportive as what a husband's supposed to be. But there was a point that you could see that it's Yoko. That's what she wants. So if that's what she wants to do, let her do it, and he steps aside. He
Okay.
doesn't even, and that's really what it became. It's like he stepped aside and let her do whatever she wanted to do.
Okay. Myth number 2, how you and John got together. Because Yoko has always claimed that she got the two of you together. And she did. But that's kind of where it ends. That's sort of where her involvement ends, because this quickly spiraled out of her control. So,
yeah, it did.
Yeah. She did not expect you to fall in love.
No. And I heard years later, I'm talking to Jerry Rubin, right? And and this is after we had all split apart and all this, and I see him that he had gotten a position on Wall Street, and I just remember thinking he always wanted to be a capitalist. I don't care what anybody said. He was not one of my favorite people, because I just thought that I knew he was heading somewhere, and I called him up, and the first thing he said to me is, "How did you find me?" I said, "What do you mean, Jerry? You're all over the newspaper. You got a new job. How did I find you? What do you mean by that?" So he goes, "Oh," and then he asked a question. He goes, "Do you speak to Yoko or anything?" I said, "No. Do you?" And he said, "Yes." So that surprised me. And I said, "Oh, anything new?" Right? And he said, "Well," I said, "Did she say anything?" She goes, "Well, she was quite surprised that she thought that you and John would only last 2 weeks." I said, "Oh," and she didn't expect where it went off to.
So there she is. You guys take off for LA, and she's always said that she sent John to LA. You guys made that decision one day. The next morning, you're on.
She didn't know we were going. In fact, we went there on our own. We called her a few days later just to let her know why he's not in the Dakota wandering around. We're in LA. We left the same night. He actually asked the lawyer had come in to see him, and he said, "Harold, when are you going back to LA?" And he goes, "Tonight." And he looked at me, goes, "Well, we're going with him tonight, so get the tickets ready. We're going." Wow. So we left on the spot.
Later on, she's calling you multiple times every day. How was he reacting to that? Now, I gather that you're only hearing one side of the conversation, but could you kind of get the gist of what she was trying to do with all the phone calls?
Well, I think she was trying to feel him out. Are you okay? Everything all right? Is this what you want? That type of thing. And John was fine. And so every so often she tried to throw a monkey wrench in there to see where his head was at. And John would defend me, in all the case. "Oh, May just wants this." And she goes, "No, she doesn't," and so there was all these little innuendos that she tried, because he would tell me. The thing that he did that she didn't realize was he was telling me everything all the way down the line. He was not holding back. And at one point, when she did say that she was out to see someone, and I said to John, "How do you feel about that?" And he goes, "A load has been, taken off my back." He goes, "I was feeling miserable because I was feeling happy. And then I thought she was sitting up there alone, and she wasn't. So I'm even more happy because now that comes off my shoulders."
Interesting. And then she winds up asking for a divorce.
She does, because she's now tried everything. He wasn't moving the needle to come home. So she asked for divorce. And I heard about it before John, because the lawyer said to me, "Don't want you to come to the office with him. It's going to be in our office. She's going to ask for divorce. She wants it there because she thinks John's going to freak out." Well, it didn't happen the way she wanted again. And he comes home and he hands me a coat that was hanging, and he told Yoko, he says, "Listen, she needs a coat. It's wintertime. We don't have the money right now to buy a whole new wardrobe. So you're not using that for a coat. Give it to me." And she didn't want to give it to me. And she says, "I'll give it to you under the condition you tell her it's from me." So this whole thing. But when he came in, I said, "How did the meeting go?" And he said, "I'm going to be a free man in 6 months," was his line.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, going back to the myth that she's perpetuating about how tight they were, I always thought that was her voice on Number 9 Dream, whispering, John, John. So when I watched the movie, and I hope I'm not giving away too much here, when I watched the movie and found out that was your voice, now I hear the song in a completely different way. It totally changes my impression of the song.
Yeah, that whole album of Walls and Bridges was done completely with just John and myself. John didn't have anybody else helping him. You know, there was no co-producer, no nothing. He did everything. It was his album from top to bottom. He did it in 8 weeks. He was absolutely thrilled. He kept saying, I broke the record. He goes, it's 8 weeks from start to finish. I love it, you know. And he kept it within budget. So he was quite happy.
Mm-hmm. You were involved in really all of his solo albums, except for, of course,
Double Fantasy.
Yeah, you weren't involved in Double Fantasy for obvious reasons. I have to throw out this last thing since we're going to get cut off here. I could not believe that Paul McCartney showed up with a message from Yoko, and I won't say what it was, but you think of them as being kind of enemies, and for him to come in with that message must have felt like a betrayal to you. It must have just been shocking.
I think I have to look at the situation. He didn't know who I was, and I guess for him, he already knew what Yoko was about. So to him, it's probably, okay, we can't start over. We know where this is. We don't know what the X factor here is. So let's stay with where we know. You know, I could see that. But as time went on, he got to know me a little bit better. They would just show up at my doorstep. I think, you know, and like I said, the first night, they were our first visitor at our apartment. And John would say, are you okay with them coming up? And he was shocked too. I said, I don't know how they found out where we lived. I said, yeah, they're your friends. It's okay. Send them up.
And you were the one who went to Linda's funeral. It wasn't Yoko. So You obviously maintained that relationship. Best of luck with the film. It's wonderful. I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, May. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Rock is lit, confidential.